The blood soaking my apron cost me my only ticket out of this city. I thought I was saving a dying mute drifter in the rain. I was dead wrong. I didn't save a helpless man. I accidentally bloodbound myself to the city's most ruthless, hunted alpha heir. And the cartel that slaughtered his family? They just kicked down my door. Chapter 1. The smell of stale fryer grease and cheap bleach could not hide the sharp, sour scent of a cartel enforcer. Sloane froze by the coffee station, her fingers tightened around a wet $5 bill. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. The heavy thud of steel-toed boots against the diner's cracked linoleum floor told her everything. He was a sweeper, looking for unregistered shifters, looking for runaways, looking for girls exactly like her. Have you ever felt your heart hammer so hard it bruised your ribs? That was Sloane right now. She forced her breathing to slow down. She pushed the panic deep into her chest. No matter how hard she tried, the terror always clawed back up. But she had a secret. She was an omega, but an untriggered one. She could mask her sweet floral scent and replace it with the smell of old coffee and exhaustion. She turned around, wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. The enforcer sat in the corner booth. His dark eyes scanned the room. Because of that, Sloane kept her head down. She poured him a black coffee. Her hand did not shake. Years ago, she had seen what happened to girls who shook. She remembered being a kid, hiding under a broken porch in the rain, watching the cartel drag her older neighbor away. The girl had been crying. They shoved her into a black van and she was gone forever. That was the reality of this city. Omegas were not people. They were property. They were sold. And she let it happen, playing the invisible human waitress every single night. She walked back to the register. The shift was almost over. She slipped the wet $5 bill into her shoe. That was her escape fund. Every tip, every discarded coin went into a hidden envelope taped under her mattress. It had to be exactly $4,300. Why that exact number? She wouldn't let herself think about the debt she owed the smuggler. The one who promised her a fake ID. That was tomorrow's problem. Without warning, the enforcer stood up. The diner went dead silent. Sloane's breath caught. He tossed a crumpled bill on the table and walked out into the neon-lit rain. The tension broke. Sloane let out a shaky breath. She grabbed a trash bag, her hands finally trembling. The plastic ripped a little. She dragged it toward the back door. The air inside the diner was suffocating. She needed to breathe. She needed the cold air. As if pulled by a string, she pushed the heavy metal door open. The rain was falling hard. It hit the hot asphalt of the alleyway, sending up a wave of steam. But something was wrong. The air shifted. The metallic, heavy smell of fresh blood cut right through the rain. Sloane stepped into the dark alley. The rain lashed against her face. She squinted through the downpour, her eyes adjusting to the shadows near the dumpsters. A massive shape lay crumpled against the brick wall. Her instincts surged. She wanted to run. She wanted to lock the metal door. She wanted to pretend she saw nothing. Instead, she took a step forward. It was a man, but he was huge, too huge to be just human. His clothes were torn to shreds. Dark, thick blood washed down the pavement in little rivers. It mixed with the muddy rain. Before she could move away, a low, wet sound came from his chest. He was choking. She dropped the trash bag. It hit a puddle with a loud splash. Without thinking, Sloane dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, he was terrifying. He had a brutal, scarred face. His jaw was clenched tight. He looked like a feral beast that had just lost a war. She reached out, her hands hovering over his chest. He was torn open. Deep, jagged claw marks ripped across his ribs. This was cartel work. Because it was cartel work, she knew she should walk away right now. If they found her with him, she was dead. Or worse, she would end up in a cage. But then, his eyes snapped open. Sloane gasped and fell back on her hands. His eyes were not human. They were pitch black, rimmed with a glowing feral gold. The sheer power radiating from him hit her like a physical wave. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. But those eyes locked onto hers with a savage, burning intensity. Between one breath and the next, something inside her shifted. She remembered a stray dog she found when she was 10. It was starving, cornered in an alley just like this one. She had given it her last piece of bread. The dog had looked at her with that exact same desperate, silent plea. This man was dying. He was a lethal, dangerous apex predator. But he was dying alone in the dirt. Can you really walk away when a soul begs you to stay? Her latent omega empathy, the very thing she hated, the very thing that made her a target, flared to life. It burned hot in her chest. She couldn't stop it. The need to heal him, to protect him, completely overtook her street smarts. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay, I got you." He didn't blink. He just watched her. She grabbed his massive arm. "You have to help me," she grunted, pulling with all her strength. "I can't carry you. Get up." She didn't know how she did it. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was sheer adrenaline. She dragged the hulking, bleeding man through the back door. She hid him in the dry storage room. The room smelled like flour and onions. Now it smelled like rain and copper. He was unconscious again. Sloane leaned against the metal shelves, gasping for air. Her hands were covered in his blood. It was warm and sticky. She wiped them on her apron, leaving dark red smears. What followed was the hardest decision of her life. She pulled out her cheap burner phone. Her hands shook violently as she dialed a number she promised herself she would never use. Doc was a black market street medic. He didn't ask questions, but he demanded cash up front. Lots of it. "Diner, back room," she whispered into the phone. "Bring the heavy stuff. He's a shifter." She hung up before Doc could say no. Then, she ran. She ran out of the diner, up the wet fire escape, and into her tiny, crumbling apartment above the kitchen. She tore her mattress off the bed. She ripped the white envelope from the tape. $4,300. Her ticket out. Her safety. Her whole life. She stared at the money. A tear slipped down her cheek. She was being stupid. She was throwing her life away for a dead man. Yet, she ran back downstairs. Doc was already there when she got back. He was a skinny, nervous man. He took one look at the giant lichen bleeding on the flour sacks. He shook his head. "I don't mess with cartel hits, Sloane. I'm out." "Wait." Sloane shoved the thick envelope into Doc's chest. "Take it. Take all of it. Just fix him." Doc looked at the money. He looked at Sloane. Eventually, he sighed and opened his bag. For 2 hours, Sloane paced the tiny room. She watched Doc stitch, staple, and wrap the massive wounds. The silence stretched. The only sound was the heavy, rattling breath of the strange man. By the time Doc packed his bags and left out the back door, the diner was completely quiet. The sun was going to come up soon. Sloane sat on an overturned bucket next to the man. She had no money. She had no escape plan. She was trapped. As the silence roared in her ears, she buried her face in her hands. She wanted to cry, but she was too tired. A sudden warm roughness touched her knee. She jumped, her breath catching. The man was awake. He had shifted his massive body. His large, scarred hand was resting gently against her leg. His golden eyes were wide open, staring at her through the dim light of the storage room. He didn't say a word. He didn't make a sound. But the way he looked at her, like she was the only light in a pitch-black world, made the hair on her arms stand up. Under the weight of his stare, the space between them burned. He slowly pulled his hand back and tapped the center of his own chest, right over his heart. Then, he pointed a single, trembling finger at her. He knew. He knew she gave up everything. The blood debt was sealed. Sloane stared at his trembling finger. As the silence stretched, a horrifying sound filled the small room. It sounded like wet canvas ripping. Sloane scrambled backward. She knocked into the metal shelving. Cans of tomatoes rattled above her. The man was moving. He shouldn't be moving. Doc had just stapled his chest closed. Yet, before she could move, the heavy medical staples began to pop. One by one. They pinged against the concrete floor. His flesh was knitting itself back together. In the span of a breath, the deep, jagged ravines across his ribs sealed. They turned into thick white scars. The latent omega energy she had poured into him. It had acted like a catalyst. He pushed himself off the flour sacks. He was massive. In the dim light, he looked less like a man. He was more like a mountain of scarred muscle and lethal intent. He took a step toward her. With every step he took, Sloane pressed herself harder against the shelves. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped in a 10-by-10 room with an apex predator. What's worse, she could smell his sudden spike in adrenaline. It smelled like dark pine and impending violence. He stepped into her personal space. He was so close she could feel the heat rolling off his skin. Her heart skipped. He leaned down. His face was inches from her neck. Before either could speak, he inhaled deeply. He was scenting her, taking in the underlying hidden notes of her omega blood. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Sloane squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the bite. She waited for the brutal grip of a Lycan claiming territory. Instead, something incredible happened. The air thickened. He didn't bite. He exhaled a long, heavy breath. Then he slowly lowered his head. He bared his own neck to her. It was the ultimate, undeniable sign of submission. The feral beast was yielding to the waitress. Between them, something cracked. Her lifelong belief that she was prey shattered in an instant. But then the floorboards above them groaned. Without warning, the diner's front door crashed open with a deafening bang. Heavy, familiar boots slammed against the linoleum. The sweepers were back. Her blood ran cold. "Stay," Sloane mouthed the word. She shoved a hand against his massive, scarred chest. It felt like pushing against solid iron. "Do not move." Her body moved on instinct. She grabbed a clean apron, throwing it over her bloody shirt. She sprinted up the narrow stairs and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. The diner was flooded with harsh neon light. 3 cartel enforcers stood in the center of the room. The one from earlier was back, and he had brought friends. Because of that, Sloane knew they hadn't just forgotten their change. "We're closed," she called out. Her voice trembled, just a fraction. The lead sweeper sneered. He pointed a thick, silver-ringed finger at the floor. As if the world narrowed, Sloane followed his gaze. A single dark smear of blood stained the white tiles near the entrance. She had missed a spot. "Looks like somebody had an accident," the sweeper said. His voice was smooth, like oiled glass. "Or maybe somebody dragged a dying dog inside." She didn't know what scared her more. The fact that they knew. Or the fact that the dying dog was currently standing in her basement, fully healed and ready to kill. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She grabbed a mop bucket. "A drunk," Sloane lied. "Cut his hand on a broken bottle outside. I chased him off." The sweeper smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. In the quiet that followed, he unclipped a heavy, silver-laced baton from his belt. "Let's take a look in the back, just to be sure." Her chest ached. She stepped in front of the kitchen doors. "You can't go back there," she said. He shoved her. Hard. Sloane hit the counter. Her hips slammed against the sharp edge. she gasped, sliding to the floor, which meant she couldn't stop him. The sweeper kicked the swinging doors open and marched down the dark hallway. Sloane scrambled to her feet. "No!" she screamed. She ran after him. The hallway was a narrow tunnel of flickering fluorescent light. At the end of it was the heavy metal door to the dry storage. The sweeper reached for the handle. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The metal door didn't just open, it was ripped off its hinges. A massive, shadowy blur exploded from the basement. The moment their eyes locked, the sweeper raised his baton. But he was too slow. He was human, and the thing coming out of the dark was a nightmare given flesh. Roman slammed into the enforcer. The sheer force of the impact lifted the sweeper entirely off his feet. They crashed into the opposite wall. The drywall shattered. Dust rained down. Sloane froze. She watched, paralyzed. Roman's massive hand wrapped around the sweeper's throat. There was no roar. There was no growl. As the silence roared, Roman simply twisted his wrist. A wet, sickening snap echoed through the hallway. The sweeper went limp. Roman dropped the body. It hit the floor like a sack of wet cement. Before she could move, the other two enforcers burst through the swinging doors, their guns drawn. "Hey!" one yelled. Without another word, Roman turned. His pitch-black eyes locked onto the new threats. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward. He moved with terrifying, fluid grace. He ducked under a gunshot. The bullet shattered the overhead light, plunging the hallway into darkness. As the sky darkened, all Sloane could hear was the sickening crunch of bone and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. It took less than 10 seconds. When the silence returned, it was heavy, suffocating. Roman stepped out of the shadows. He was covered in fresh blood, but none of it was his. He walked toward Sloane, her world tilted. She had just become an accessory to the murder of 3 cartel enforcers. Her ordinary life was gone, buried under 3 dead bodies. Roman stopped in front of her. He reached out and gently, so gently, wiped a speck of blood from her cheek with his thumb. Then he grabbed her hand. His grip was firm, a silent promise. Because of that, she didn't pull away. He pulled her toward the back door, out into the blinding neon rain. And she let it happen. The rain was a freezing sheet against her skin. What followed was a blind, desperate sprint through the darkest parts of the city. Roman never let go of her hand. He pulled her through twisting alleyways and over rusted chain-link fences. Eventually, they ducked into the gaping maw of an abandoned subway station. The air down here smelled like damp concrete and old iron. Water dripped steadily from the cracked ceiling. Sloane collapsed against a graffiti-covered pillar. She dragged deep, burning breaths into her lungs. Her legs were shaking so hard she could barely stand. Have you ever felt truly hunted? It strips away everything human. It leaves nothing but the animal urge to survive. She looked at Roman. He stood perfectly still near the entrance, scanning the dark stairs. He wasn't even breathing hard. "We need a plan," Sloane choked out. Her voice echoed in the empty terminal. "They know my face. Because they saw me in the diner, my whole life is gone." He turned his head and looked at her. His black eyes were unreadable. "Who are you?" she demanded. Panic made her voice sharp. "Because I just ruined my life for you, I think I deserve a name." "What did you do to make them hunt you?" As the silence stretched, the dripping water sounded like a ticking clock. He didn't say a word. He just stared at her. "Answer me!" she yelled. The sound bounced off the dirty tiles. She remembered a time a wild rat got trapped in her tiny kitchen. It had thrown itself blindly against the walls, terrified and mute. Unable to understand, it was trapped. Right now, she felt exactly like that rat. Trapped in the dark with no way out. Still, he remained perfectly silent. Because of that, a chilling realization slowly crept down her spine. She watched his chest rise and fall. She watched the tight clench of his jaw. He wasn't ignoring her. The muscles in his throat corded tightly, as if he was physically fighting invisible chains. He couldn't speak. His silence wasn't a choice. It was a prison. Which meant she was on her own to figure this out. Instead of pushing him, Sloane slid down the pillar. She sat on the wet floor. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. You can't talk." Roman walked over to her. He knelt in the grime. He reached out with one massive finger and drew something in the thick layer of dust on the floor. It was a crest, a highly detailed modern corporate logo, 2 wolves circling a jagged moon. But then, he pointed up, toward the surface, toward the glittering financial district of the city. And she understood exactly where they had to go next. From there, they moved like ghosts through the shadows. The transition from the rotting slums to the financial district was jarring. Suddenly, the cracked pavement turned into pristine cobblestones. The smell of garbage faded. It was replaced by the cold, sharp scent of ozone and expensive glass. Sloane felt completely exposed. She remembered a man who used to come into the diner late at night. He always wore a silk suit and paid with a platinum card. He looked at everyone like they were dirt. This entire district felt exactly like that man. Untouchable. Dangerous. Roman led her into a narrow access alley between 2 massive glass towers. Without warning, he stopped in front of a blank steel wall. He pressed his large hand flat against the metal. A hidden scanner hummed to life. A red laser swept over his scarred palm. The machine clicked. Because he was supposed to be a dead drifter, the heavy steel door shouldn't have opened. But it hissed and slid backward. They stepped into a sleek, hidden room. It was an encrypted syndicate cache. Sloane's jaw dropped. The walls were lined with military-grade weapons. There were stacks of banded cash in a thick safe. Not only that, but there was a glowing tablet resting on a silver table. Roman moved immediately to the weapons. He began strapping heavy, silver-laced knives to his thighs. He moved with speed. He moved with power. He moved with absolute purpose. Sloane walked toward the table. Her hands were shaking again. She picked up the tablet. The screen was already active. It displayed a highly secured hit list. Her breath caught. There, right at the top of the screen, was her face. It was a security photo from the diner. But that wasn't the terrifying part. Next to her photo was a massive bounty and a status label that made her blood run cold. It read, "Priority target, untriggered Omega, capture alive. Who put her name on a Billionaire syndicate's private server?" How did they know she was an Omega when she had hidden it her entire life? Before she could process the fear, a shrill alarm pierced the quiet room. The tablet flashed red. To make things worse, they had just triggered a silent proximity tripwire. Roman grabbed her arm. It was time to run again. They burst out of the cache and into an underground parking structure. The garage was massive. It smelled like exhaust fumes and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, unnatural shadows. A tiny red light blinked near the ceiling. A security drone. It had already found them. Because the drone was tracking them, they had less than a minute before the heavy hitters arrived. "We need a car," Sloane gasped, pointing toward a row of luxury vehicles. Before either could speak, the shadows above them detached. A tracking Lycan dropped from the concrete rafters. He landed directly between them and the cars. He didn't look like Roman. He was fully shifted. A massive, gray-furred beast, with slavering jaws and wild yellow eyes. The beast locked onto Sloane. It ignored Roman completely. Because the bounty was on her, the tracker wanted the Omega. The beast lunged. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. She wanted to scream. She wanted to freeze. She wanted to disappear. As if summoned, her latent instincts finally snapped awake. If this beast wanted an Omega, she would give him one. Sloane closed her eyes. She stopped suppressing her nature. She pushed her terror down. and forced her biological scent to flood the damp air. It bloomed like an explosion, a suffocating, overwhelming wave of pure floral sweetness. It was so thick, it felt like honey in the back of the throat. The tracker hit the wall of scent and choked. The beast gagged, its highly sensitive nose overwhelmed by the sudden spike in omega pheromones. It stumbled, shaking its massive head, entirely blinded by the smell. That was all the opening Roman needed. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Roman slammed into the beast. The impact echoed through the garage like a thunderclap. He didn't even use the weapons he had just gathered. He used his bare hands. Sloane watched, terrified and mesmerized. Roman broke the tracker's neck, with a brutal, silent twist. He dropped the massive wolf. It hit the floor and didn't move. Roman turned to her. The golden ring around his dark eyes was glowing brightly in the dim garage. He looked at her not with anger, but with profound, absolute awe. She had fought back. She had saved them. He grabbed a set of keys from a nearby valet box. He smashed the window of a sleek black sedan. She felt it, etched in fire. The bond between them was shifting. She wasn't just his cargo anymore. She was his partner. They got into the car. The engine roared to life. The tires screeched against the concrete. Roman floored the gas pedal. They shot up the exit ramp, blasting through the wooden security gate, and disappeared into the blinding neon night. The black sedan tore through the slick, empty streets. Roman drove with a single steady hand on the steering wheel. Because he drove so fast, Sloane pressed her back hard against the plush leather seat. The smell of expensive car interior and stale rain filled the small space. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs. Eventually, he swerved into a hidden underground garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. That night, they didn't speak. They rode a private, silent elevator all the way to the top floor. The doors slid open. They stepped into a massive penthouse safehouse. It was breathtaking. The walls were made entirely of glass. They overlooked the glittering city skyline. The floors were cold, white marble, but it felt sterile, like a beautiful hospital room. Without another word, Roman gently grabbed her elbow. He guided her into a massive, brightly lit bathroom. He opened a mirror cabinet and pulled out a white first aid kit. As the silence stretched, he wet a soft cloth with warm water. He turned to her. She felt it, etched in fire. The intense focus in his dark eyes made her breath catch. He slowly began to wipe the dried blood and dirt from her face and arms. His massive hands were calloused and covered in thick scars. Yet, his touch was incredibly soft. Have you ever watched a monster treat someone like fragile glass? She remembered a time she found a bird with a broken wing on the sidewalk. She had scooped it up with shaking hands, terrified of hurting it more. That was exactly how Roman was treating her right now. Because she was an untriggered omega, her deepest biological instincts screamed at her to lean closer to him, to seek his warmth. With every heartbeat, the space between them burned. He gently tilted her chin up. He dabbed a cut on her cheek. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she stared at his mouth. She watched the tight line of his jaw. The feral wolf inside him was completely quiet, replaced by a fierce, silent protector. Between one breath and the next, he stopped cleaning. His thumb traced her lower lip, and she let it happen. But then, reality crashed back into her. She pulled away, her chest heaving. She reached into her damp jacket pocket and pulled out the glowing tablet they took from the cache. She had to know what they were dealing with. Sloane sat on the edge of a massive white leather couch. From there, her fingers flew across the digital keyboard. Because the files were highly encrypted, she had to use every trick she learned from her old street hacker friends. Maybe it was fate. When she typed in the coordinates of the cache, the screen flashed green. Access granted. As the truth unraveled, Sloane couldn't breathe. She tapped on a master folder labeled Legacy. In that moment, a high-resolution photograph loaded onto the screen. It was Roman, but he looked completely different. He wasn't covered in alleyway dirt. He didn't have the massive claw scars across his face. He was wearing a dark, custom-tailored suit. He looked like a billionaire king. Beneath the picture, the text was clear. Roman Thorne, Alpha Heir. Status: deceased. Her world tilted. She read the attached files. Her eyes darted back and forth. The cartel hunting her wasn't just a local street gang. They were the private mercenary arm of a massive corporate syndicate. Worse, they were the usurpers who stole Roman's throne. They had slaughtered his entire family in a violent coup 10 years ago, which meant he wasn't a nameless drifter. He was the rightful king of the city's underworld. She didn't know what scared her more. The fact that she was permanently tied to a ghost, or the fact that this ghost owned the very monsters she had been hiding from her whole life. It was like pulling a loose thread on a cheap sweater, only to watch the entire world unravel right before your eyes. Sloane slowly looked up from the screen. Roman was standing by the glass window, staring out at the city. The moment their eyes locked, she finally understood his silence. She saw the ghost of a king trapped inside a mute beast. She saw his profound grief. She saw his buried rage. She saw his agonizing, silent war. Because he was the true alpha, his fight was her fight now. The stakes had just exploded. They weren't just fighting for her freedom anymore. Without warning, a deafening siren shattered the quiet penthouse. Red emergency lights began to flash wildly from the ceiling. To make things worse, the tracking signal on the tablet had just been located. They were here. Before she could move, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows exploded inward. A shower of shattered glass rained down like deadly, jagged diamonds. The freezing wind howled into the room. As if pulled by a string, Roman crossed the room in a blur. He shoved Sloane hard behind a thick concrete pillar. Heavy gunfire erupted. Bullets chewed through the white leather couch. They tore the pristine walls to shreds. 5 men rappelled into the living room from the roof above. They wore black tactical gear. They held military-grade assault rifles. Not only that, they moved with perfect precision. These were not street-level cartel sweepers. These were elite syndicate death squads. Because they had high-powered rifles, Roman couldn't just rush them with brute force. He would be cut to pieces. Instead, he shifted his entire stance. He stopped moving like a wild feral wolf. What followed was a terrifying display of pure combat mastery. He fought like an elite soldier. In the span of a breath, Roman whipped his arm forward. A silver-laced blade flew through the air. It buried itself deep into the neck of the closest gunman. The man dropped instantly. Next, Roman dropped to the floor. He rolled across the broken glass, entirely ignoring the cuts on his skin. He snatched the dead man's fallen rifle. With every step he took, he fired with deadly, calculated accuracy. 2 more men went down before they could even aim. While her pulse raced, Sloane peeked from behind the concrete pillar. She watched him decimate the squad. He moved with lethal grace. He struck with perfect timing. He destroyed with absolute cold focus. Eventually, the gunfire stopped. The last man fell backward, crashing through a glass coffee table. The room was completely silent, except for the harsh winter wind blowing through the shattered windows. Roman dropped the empty rifle. His chest heaved. He looked back at Sloane, his dark eyes checking her for injuries. That's why they couldn't stay here. The usurpers knew he was alive. The penthouse was completely compromised. As the echo faded, the smell of gunpowder and smoke choked the air. Roman walked over and grabbed her hand tightly. They had survived the night. But they were entirely alone against a billionaire army. If they were going to win this war, they needed allies. And Sloane knew exactly where to find them, even if it meant returning to the people she trusted the least. The freezing rain returned as they escaped the burning penthouse. Because the syndicate owned the sky, they had to disappear underground. Sloane led Roman through a maze of flooded subway tunnels. The smell of raw sewage and wet rust clung to the damp air. From there, she found a shattered payphone hidden beneath a broken street lamp. She stared at the dirty plastic receiver. She didn't know what scared her more: calling her only street contact, or fighting a billionaire army completely alone. Marcus was her old boss from the diner. He ran an underground information network. He was the closest thing she had to family. But in this city, family was just a liability. Have you ever trusted someone, even when every instinct screamed at you to run? She remembered feeding a stray cat behind her apartment when she was a little girl. She brought it milk every single day for a month. One night, she reached out to pet it. The cat shredded her arm and vanished into the dark. That was the lesson the streets taught her. Trust always ended in bleeding. Even so, she picked up the phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Marcus's secret number. The air thickened. "I need the architectural blueprints for the Thorn Syndicate Tower," she whispered into the receiver. As the silence stretched, Marcus let out a heavy sigh. He knew exactly who she was. He knew exactly what she was asking for. "Neon Howl Nightclub. 1 hour," Marcus replied. His voice was tight. "Come alone, Sloane." He hung up. The line went dead. Sloane dropped the receiver. She turned around. Roman stood in the shadows, his massive frame perfectly still. He was watching her. She felt it, etched in fire. He knew she was risking everything. Without thinking, she walked up to him. She placed her hand flat against his broad, scarred chest. "We are going to a club," she said softly. "It is a neutral zone. You cannot fight. You cannot shift." Under the weight of his stare, Roman slowly nodded. He understood. Which meant they were walking straight into a den of wolves. The nightclub was a chaotic mess of sound and smell. The heavy bass thumped so hard it rattled her teeth. The air was suffocating, thick with cheap perfume, spilled alcohol, and the aggressive scents of 100 different shifters. Sloane pushed through the crowded dance floor. Roman followed closely behind her. With every step he took, the crowd naturally parted. People took one look at his towering, scarred physique. They scrambled out of his way. Eventually, they reached the VIP booths in the back. Marcus sat alone at a glass table. He pushed a small silver flash drive across the polished surface. Because he looked terrified, Sloane's stomach twisted into a tight knot. "The codes are on there," Marcus muttered. He wouldn't look her in the eye. Every security bypass for the penthouse. Before she could grab the drive, a massive hand slammed down on the table. Without warning, a rival cartel alpha stepped into their booth. He was huge, heavily tattooed. He reeked of sour aggression. He sneered at Sloane. "Well, well." The rival alpha laughed. "Look at the little human waitress playing in the deep end. You smell sweet tonight." He reached out to grab her hair. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Roman moved. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't draw a blade. He simply stepped between Sloane and the rival alpha. The moment their eyes locked, Roman unleashed his presence. He didn't make a sound, but the sheer, crushing weight of his dormant alpha power slammed into the room. It was a physical force. It felt like gravity suddenly doubled. The rival alpha choked. His knees buckled. He fought with his pride. He fought with his anger. He fought with his feral instincts. But it didn't matter. The rival alpha hit the floor, entirely submitted by a man who hadn't spoken a single word. Roman glared down at him. Between them, something cracked. The absolute authority radiating from Roman was undeniable. Her heart skipped. Sloane snatched the flash drive from the table. She looked at Marcus one last time. Then she grabbed Roman's arm, and she let it happen, pulling her silent king out of the club before a full riot could start. They found a new hideout in an abandoned auto garage. The smell of old motor oil and decaying rubber was strong. Sloane sat on the hood of a rusted car, her laptop balanced on her knees. From there, she plugged the silver flash drive into the port. Roman stood by the cracked garage door. He was keeping watch. The moonlight cast long, jagged shadows across his face. She opened the files. As the truth unraveled, a cold dread pooled in her stomach. She looked at the complex lines of code. She wasn't just a waitress. She knew how to read basic encryption. These weren't security bypass codes. They were active beacon signals. To make things worse, a red loading bar appeared on her screen. It was transmitting their exact location back to the syndicate servers. Her breath caught. Marcus hadn't given her a weapon. He had given her a tracking device. Her found family had just sold her out to the monsters. Do you know what it feels like when the ice finally breaks? She remembered walking on a frozen lake when she was 15. The ice had felt thick and solid. But then, she heard a sharp crack beneath her boots. Before she could react, the freezing black water swallowed her whole. Right now, she was drowning all over again. Because of that betrayal, her chest ached. She had trusted Marcus. She had broken her own rule. Her voice trembled. Roman. He turned around instantly. It's a trap, she whispered, her eyes filled with angry tears. The drive is a reverse tracer. They know exactly where we are. As the echo faded, the quiet auto garage felt like a tomb. She slammed the laptop shut. She threw the flash drive onto the concrete floor. She crushed it beneath her boot. But it was too late. The signal had already been sent. Before either could speak, the heavy steel doors of the garage began to glow bright orange. Thermal cutting torches were slicing through the metal. Sparks rained down on the greasy floor. The smell of burning ozone filled the air. As the sky darkened outside, the heavy steel doors blew completely off their hinges. As the sky darkened outside, the heavy steel doors blew completely off their hinges. Without warning, a dozen syndicate elites flooded into the garage. They didn't carry guns. Because they knew bullets wouldn't stop an alpha, they carried strange sonic cannons. They aimed the wide barrels directly at the center of the room. Before she could move, the elites fired the weapons. There was no explosion. Instead, a high-pitched, agonizing frequency shattered the air. Have you ever heard a sound so loud it makes your vision go completely black? The noise pierced Sloane's skull like a hot needle. She collapsed to her knees. She clamped her hands over her ears. But the sound bypassed her eardrums completely. It vibrated right inside her teeth. What's worse, the sonic waves were specifically tuned to Lycan nervous systems. She looked up through watering eyes. Roman was screaming, but no sound came out of his mouth. The massive Lycan crashed heavily to the concrete floor. He clutched his head. His massive body writhed in absolute agony. Because the frequency paralyzed his muscles, he couldn't even shift to protect himself. He was trapped in his human form, completely defenseless. Her chest ached. She tried to crawl toward him. She wanted to shield him. No matter how hard she tried, the pain was simply too much to fight through. In that moment, heavy tactical boots surrounded her. Rough hands grabbed her arms. They hoisted her violently off the floor. She fought. She kicked. She screamed. But it was useless. They slapped a pair of thick metal cuffs around her wrists, locking her arms behind her back. The moment their eyes locked, she saw Roman fighting just to reach her. He dragged himself across the broken glass on his elbows. Blood poured down his face. His golden eyes were filled with pure desperation. Between them, something cracked. It was the feeling of her entire world ending. A syndicate guard stepped over Roman. He pulled out a massive syringe filled with a glowing green liquid. He injected it directly into Roman's neck. She didn't know what that glowing serum would do to his already fractured mind. It was a terrifying mystery she had to solve later. As if pulled by a string, the guards dragged her out of the garage. leaving her silent king bleeding out on the cold floor. She was thrown roughly into the pitch-black back of a transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, locking her in absolute darkness. The engine roared to life. The van sped away into the stormy night. Inside the metal box, the smell of fear and stale sweat was suffocating. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that Roman was captured, or the fact that she was finally going to be sold into a billionaire's cage. Have you ever lost absolutely everything in a single second? She remembered building a towering house of cards when she was a little girl. She spent hours holding her breath, getting it perfectly right. Then, a sudden gust of wind blew through the cracked window. It destroyed everything instantly, leaving nothing but a useless mess on the floor. Her new life with Roman was that ruined house of cards. Still, she refused to die like a helpless victim. As her wolf stirred, or rather, her latent omega instincts, a new kind of cold focus washed over her mind. Her body moved on instinct. She dragged her bound hands across the dirty floor of the moving van, searching the darkness. Her fingers brushed against something incredibly sharp. It was a jagged shard of metal from the blown garage doors. It was deeply stuck in the rubber floor matting. Because she had absolutely nothing left to lose, she didn't hesitate. She wedged the metal shard tightly between her knees. She dragged the thick plastic zip ties up and down against the sharp edge. It cut her wrists. It sliced her sensitive skin. Warm blood dripped down her freezing hands. Even so, she kept sawing back and forth. With every heartbeat, the thick plastic grew thinner and weaker. Eventually, with a sharp snap, her bloody hands burst free. Without warning, the van hit a massive pothole. She stumbled. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher bolted to the metal wall to steady herself. A beat later, the partition window slid open. A guard peeked into the dark back area to check on her. Without thinking, she swung the heavy metal cylinder directly into his face. The guard crumpled instantly. She reached through the open window. She ripped the back door release lever as hard as she could. The heavy metal doors flew open, revealing the wet, speeding road below her. And she let it happen, throwing herself blindly out of the moving vehicle and into the violent storm. Sloane hit the wet asphalt incredibly hard. She tumbled wildly across the slick road. The pavement tore the skin from her knees and elbows. She rolled to a painful stop in a dark, empty alleyway. Her breath caught. She was bleeding. She was broken. She was completely alone. By the time she finally dragged herself out of the freezing rain, she looked up at her surroundings. As the echo faded, she realized exactly where she had landed. Maybe it was fate. She had run blindly through the dark city, only to end up right back behind her old diner. She stared at the exact same rusted dumpsters. She smelled the exact same metallic scent of rain and old fryer grease. She slumped against the cold, familiar brick wall. This was the ultimate lowest point. She had spent her entire adult life hiding her omega nature. She hid it because she truly believed it made her weak and vulnerable. She thought living in total isolation was the only armor that worked, but looking at the dark blood stain on the pavement where she first found Roman, she finally realized how wrong she was. Do you know what true strength actually looks like? It isn't hiding in the shadows. It is standing proudly in the fire and refusing to burn away. Because she hid her power, they lost the fight. Because she played the helpless victim, Roman was taken from her. In the quiet that followed, a deep primal anger ignited in her stomach. It wasn't the frantic, messy panic of a street rat. It was the cold, highly focused fury of an Omega Queen. Her world tilted. She closed her eyes. She reached deep into the center of her chest. She grabbed hold of the sweet, intoxicating floral scent she had suppressed for 20 long years. She didn't push it down. Instead, she ripped the heavy chains completely off her biology. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, her massive Omega aura exploded into the alleyway. It was huge, it was dominant, it was pure, raw power. She felt it, etched in fire. Her emotional empathy wasn't a fatal weakness. It was a lethal weapon that could bend entire wild packs to her absolute will. Would this massive burst of Omega energy draw the usurpers back to her, creating a trap she couldn't escape? She opened her eyes, and the old fear was entirely gone. Her thoughts spun with a singular, unbreakable goal. She was going to tear the corrupt corporate syndicate straight to the ground, which meant she was going to war to get her king back. As if summoned, the dark shadows of the alleyway began to move. Her sweet, powerful Omega scent flooded the cold rain. Because she stopped hiding her true nature, the scent acted like a massive beacon. Soon after, a man stepped out from behind the wet dumpsters. He was incredibly thin. His clothes were nothing but dirty rags. His yellow eyes glowed in the dark. Eventually, another shifter dropped down from a rusted fire escape. Then a woman limped out of a broken doorway. Have you ever seen a pack of starving street dogs? She remembered feeding the strays near her childhood home. They were always terrified, always beaten down by the cruel city. But when they finally realized she had food, they would follow her anywhere. Right now, she wasn't offering food. She was offering hope. Because the fake kings of the syndicate had treated them like garbage, these discarded shifters were broken. Yet, they slowly formed a wide circle around her. In that moment, Sloane stood up very straight. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She didn't hide. The cartel took him, Sloane said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. They took the true alpha. They took Roman. The crowd of broken shifters murmured. The wind carried his name through the dark alley. What followed was a profound, silent shift in the air. They think we are weak, Sloane yelled over the pouring rain. They think Omegas are just property. They think the street packs are just trash. Her body moved on instinct as she stepped closer to the thin man. Because she was angry, her Omega aura flared with intense fury. I am going to the glass tower. I am going to tear it down. As the silence stretched, the ragged shifters looked at each other. Before either could speak, the thin man dropped to one knee. He bowed his head right in the muddy puddles. With every heartbeat, the rest of the pack followed. 50 wild, forgotten shifters knelt before a waitress in a dirty apron. And she let it happen, accepting her role as their new queen. Which meant it was time to march on the castle. From there, she led her wild army down into the flooded subway tunnels. They moved with surprising speed. The air smelled like wet fur and old rust. Sloane marched at the front. Her mind raced with terrible questions. What was that glowing green serum doing to Roman right now? Was it melting his mind? Or was it keeping him paralyzed? She had to find out before it was too late. To make things worse, they had no guns. Because the street pack had absolutely nothing, they grabbed broken pipes. They picked up heavy rocks. They snapped thick metal chains off the subway walls. Do you know what true desperation looks like? She remembered a time the diner caught fire when she was 18. The kitchen doors were locked. The cook used a cast-iron frying pan to smash through a brick wall to escape. When you have no options, anything can become a weapon. At the same time, her Omega empathy kept the pack entirely calm and focused. She felt it, etched in fire. Her emotions were a thick blanket covering their fear. Eventually, they reached the end of the long tunnel. A heavy steel grate blocked their path. Without warning, 5 Lycans from her new pack stepped forward. They grabbed the thick iron bars. With a single glance, she gave them the silent order. The Lycans ripped the heavy grate right out of the concrete wall. They stepped out into the freezing night air. Because they were right beneath the glittering Thorn Syndicate Tower, the glass building loomed over them like a giant tombstone. Shadows danced between them as they stared at the bright, clean lobby. It was highly guarded. Men in black tactical gear stood behind the thick glass doors. But then, Sloane smiled a cold, hard smile. She wasn't running away anymore, which meant she was going to bring the dirty street right into their pristine corporate world. Before she could move, the front line of her pack surged forward. Sloane picked up a heavy chunk of broken concrete from the sidewalk. Without thinking, she threw it as hard as she could. The concrete block smashed into the perfect glass doors, the glass spiderwebbed. It exploded inward with a deafening crash. What followed was absolute bloody chaos. The wild pack poured into the bright, sterile lobby. Because the syndicate guards relied on fancy technology, they were completely unprepared for pure, savage rage. The air thickened with the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. Sloane ducked under a flying chair. The alarm siren screamed from the ceiling. Red lights flashed everywhere. She fought for the lost. She fought for the broken. She fought for her king. A guard aimed his rifle at her. As if pulled by a string, the thin shifter from the alley leaped through the air. He crashed into the guard, tearing the gun away. Because she had to keep moving, Sloane didn't stop to watch. She sprinted toward the private executive elevators. Her heart skipped. The elevator doors were made of thick steel. A biometric scanner glowed on the wall next to it. She didn't know how to bypass a high-tech corporate lock. But then, she remembered Marcus's betrayal. Would he warn the fake kings that she was coming? She couldn't let a closed door stop her now. Instead of trying to hack the pad, she turned to a massive Lycan behind her. She pointed at the steel doors. A growl rose in his throat. The Lycan slammed his massive fists into the metal gap. He pulled with a sickening screech of bending steel. The heavy doors popped open, revealing an empty elevator shaft. Sloane grabbed the thick elevator cables covered in black grease. Because Roman was trapped at the very top, she started to climb into the dark. Her hands slipped, her muscles burned, but she refused to let go, dragging herself higher and higher toward the final showdown. Eventually, Sloane reached the top of the dark elevator shaft. Her muscles screamed in agonizing pain. Her hands were slick with black grease. Because she had no other choice, she kicked the heavy metal vent cover as hard as she could. It crashed to the floor. She pulled her bruised body up into the sterile penthouse laboratory. The room smelled like harsh bleach and metallic fear. In the center of the bright room, Roman was chained to a massive steel table. Thick metal cuffs pinned his scarred arms and legs. A clear tube was pumping that glowing green serum directly into his neck. Because the serum was a concentrated paralytic, his massive body was frozen. What's worse, the usurper leader stood right next to him. The man wore a sharp, expensive suit. He held a heavy silver pistol pressed directly against Roman's temple. Before she could move, the leader looked up and laughed. "You brought the street trash to my tower?" The leader sneered. "Have you ever watched someone you love face certain death?" Sloane didn't freeze. She didn't hide. She stood up to her full height, ignoring the blood dripping from her knees. As if pulled by a string, Roman's dark, desperate eyes locked onto hers. In that moment, she didn't just release her omega scent, she weaponized it. She flooded the sterile lab with a massive, invisible wave of dominating, fiery empathy. She poured every ounce of her love, her courage, and her absolute belief straight into his mind. Because she risked her entire life to save him, the final psychological wall inside Roman's head shattered. Without warning, Roman's jaw unlocked. He didn't just break the chains. He exploded. The heavy steel cuffs snapped like cheap plastic. As the silence stretched, Roman opened his mouth. For the first time in 10 long years, he unleashed a sound. It wasn't just a roar. It was a world-shaking physical wave of pure alpha command. The sound hit the room like a bomb. It rattled the glass. It shook the floorboards. Because the command was absolute, the usurper leader instantly dropped his gun. The man fell hard to his knees. He clutched his bleeding ears, biologically forced to submit to the true king. The reign of the fake corporate syndicate was officially over. What followed was absolute heavy silence. The corrupt leader lay unconscious on the white tiles. Roman stood by the broken steel table. His massive chest heaved up and down. Blood dripped from his torn wrists. He looked exhausted, like a man who had just carried the entire world on his shoulders. Her body moved on instinct. Sloane sprinted across the lab. She didn't look for bandages or medicine. She simply threw her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his scarred chest. Because his nervous system was violently overworked from fighting the serum, his skin was burning hot. With every heartbeat, she pushed her calming omega energy directly into his racing heart. She soothed his wild panic. She quieted his raging instincts. She anchored him back to reality. Slowly, his massive, trembling arms wrapped around her small frame. He pulled her tight against him. Between one breath and the next, she felt a deep, rumbling vibration in his chest. "Sloane," he whispered. Her heart skipped. His voice was incredibly deep, gravelly and rough from a decade of absolute silence. But to her, it was the most beautiful sound in the entire world. She looked up into his glowing golden eyes. Warm tears streamed down her dirty cheeks. "You spoke," she choked out, laughing and crying at the same time. "Mine," he murmured softly. He leaned down to press his forehead firmly against hers. "My queen." In the echo of his voice, the long, terrifying nightmare finally ended. Weeks later, the city felt completely different. The dark storm clouds had finally cleared. Bright morning sunshine poured into the massive Thorn Syndicate boardroom. Sloane sat in a plush leather chair. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit. The dirty diner apron was gone forever. Because she was the recognized Omega Queen, she was directing the integration of the street packs. She was giving the forgotten shifters warm homes, good jobs, and real safety. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Roman. He was no longer a feral beast hiding in a wet alley. He wore a dark suit that perfectly fit his massive, scarred frame. As he spoke to the new corporate board members, his voice was calm, commanding, and absolutely unbreakable. He ruled with logic. He ruled with power. He ruled with fairness. Do you know what happily ever after actually looks like for a street rat and a broken king? It doesn't look like a simple fairy tale. It looks like a massive empire built on trust. Sloane looked down the table at him. She saw his profound peace. She saw his quiet strength. She saw his endless love. Without thinking, she reached her hand under the heavy wooden table. A beat later, Roman's large, warm hand found hers. He laced his fingers tightly with hers, hiding their touch from the rest of the room. He didn't stop talking to the board, but he gently squeezed her hand. He sent a silent wave of pure devotion right through their fated bond. Because they had survived the absolute darkest parts of the world together, they were unbreakable. And she let it happen, smiling brightly as she looked out over their beautiful, newly conquered city.